Hello, and welcome again to another edition of Sun Dragon Tips and Tricks. I'm Rebecca. I'm the owner of Sun Dragon Art and Fiber in downtown Brevard, North Carolina. And it's Monday, so I'm at my house. Just had to shut my cat out because he's being a nuisance, but we'll try to carry on. Uh, I've been promising this for a little while. I would like to do a basic introduction to a classic sock. Now, I have to put a full disclaimer on this that I am not an expert sock knitter. I have knit a bunch of socks, but that by no means makes me an expert. I'm sure there are people watching this video who've made more socks than I have, and they might critique what I'm about to share with you. But for those of you who haven't done something like this before, and by the way, this is Hermione's everyday sock. I love this sock pattern. It is the yarn stripes. I just want to talk about the basic parts of a sock. And when we come back from looking at the drawings, I will try to demonstrate on this sock some of those basic shapes and basic parts of it. There are different ways to start a sock. This one is addressing a traditional cuff down sock. You can also start at the toe and go up, and there's lots of different ways to do heels. This has a traditional heel flap sock. I should throw in there that this is about demystifying patterns. This is not an instructional video on how to make a sock, like cast on this many stitches and go ahead and knit and do this. It is to help you understand what is happening in a pattern if you tackle one that is a cuff down sock pattern with a heel flap. So you can understand why it is telling you to do different things before you make your first sock. So let's get to it. There was a lot of stuff as I was mapping this out. Some of it got a little squished on at the end here. So I've written out as much as I can of the different things that we're going to be doing. First, to just start with the basics of socks. Today we're talking about the classic cuff down, and I should add in here heel flap. The type of heel. There are so many different types of heels. So we should talk about, with socks, you're often going top down or toe up. So there's two different ways. There's top down, in which you start at the very top of the sock and you go down towards the toe. Or there is a toe up method where you start over here and you go up. We are talking about the top down method. There are also many heels. We are going to do the flap today. We're going to talk about short rows in the middle of this flap style of heel. But there's one that only uses short rows. And there's the fish lips kiss, which is a version of the short row heel, just to name a few. This is not all of them. And that's the thing, is that a lot of people watching this, if they're more expert sock knitters, might be saying, but you forgot to mention, too much for one video. So we are doing a cuff down with a traditional heel flap. The other thing to address before we move on is that socks, a lot like tops of hats, mittens, other things like that, involve what we call small circumference knitting. Usually you're knitting in a circle in a very small circumference, which is smaller than a lot of circular needles, the traditional length circular needles come. So there's different ways to get around that obstacle of going in a circle. You could knit them flat and seam them up, but then you have a seam. Most socks do not have a seam running down the edge. And so to do that, you need to be knitting in a circle. And these are the main ways to do that. There's using double point needles, in which case you have 3 or 4 that you distribute the stitches onto. I have videos on most of these, except for this last one. We'll talk about him in a second. I have videos on these techniques. This video is not about those techniques. If you want to try one of them, I suggest you check out the other videos. Write down the words and search them on my page. Double point needles involve several straight needles with points on both ends. Magic loop is a longer circular needle than you need, so you can go through half the stitches, loop out, and come through half of them again. 2 circulars, again, divides them in half, and 1 circular takes each half of it. And what's become very popular recently are 9-inch circulars, where you actually can fit the whole small circumference onto one needle with the tips on the end. One circular needle. Sometimes it's hard to keep more than a finger or two on those needles. So some people love them and other people can't really find comfort in them. But these are the main ways that you will find people making socks. Let's look at the parts of a sock. And I am going to color code this so when we come back and talk about them in detail with all the words I wrote over there, you can kind of piece out what we're doing. We're going to be talking about 6 parts. Like I said, I'm going to color code them. So let's see. Part A is the cuff, and we'll make him pink. And while I'm color coding, I am just going to go to all the descriptions that I did. We're going to move back and forth on this big sock. We'll keep coming back to him. So part A is the cuff, and I have written that right down here. It means we're going to zoom around on my whiteboard just a little bit, but I think it'll be okay. We'll see how this goes. So the cuff, as you can see, it's straight. I mean, we're knitting in a circle, but there's not a lot of fancy stuff going on there. It's kind of a nice way to start a sock. For the cuff, and I'll give it a circle with the same color too, you're going to cast on your specified number of stitches, which again, that's going to change depending on how thin or thick the yarn is. The size sock you're making, it's going to be different for a lot of different things. So I'm not giving you a cast on number right here. You're going to cast on what the pattern tells you to do, distribute it, so move it across needles if necessary. If you're on 3 needles, divide by 3 or as close to it as you can. If you're on 2 needles, divide in half. At some point, it's going to be helpful to have half your stitches and half your stitches, whether that means 4 double points or half your stitches on one double point and a quarter on the other 2, if you only want to use 3 to hold them. That's why magic loop and 2 circular tends to set these up well if you like circular needles, because they're divided in half. One part I didn't put here, I'm going to add it in. We do need to be working in the round, so we need to join this. You got to join it in a circle. You got to start knitting in a circle. And you're going to knit straight or do ribbing. Sometimes the ribbing's only an inch at the top. Sometimes it's the whole length of the cuff. That is your personal choice. But you're going to just be knitting and purling in a circle for so many inches. Now that also depends on, do you want a short cuff or a long one? So that could change depending on if you're doing an ankle sock or a traditional length sock or a knee-high sock. And with knee-high socks, you have the calf to worry about. There's a lot of other issues in there. This is not addressing that. Often for a traditional cuff, it's about the length of the foot, but we also have all this crazy stuff in here. Often a traditional sock, if you folded it on this halfway point, they would be equal. The foot and the cuff would be equal. And so that can often be about 6 or 7 inches, could be longer. It really depends. It's really variable and it's up to you. That's the cool thing about knitting is there's wiggle room. This first part, starting up here, let me write that in. You're starting up here, you're going down, knitting in a circle, but going straight. No fancy dancy stuff, unless you want to have a fancy pattern on the cuff of your sock. That's pretty cool, but you can make it very straightforward. At least an inch of ribbing at the top of it is often enough to keep your sock up. There's other reasons socks sag, and there's books written on that. I can't tell you all the details on that. But the next part of this, when you look at a sock, you might see all these different shapes in it. The next part of what most traditional cuff down patterns with a heel flap is actually the heel flap. That is this part right here is what usually gets knit next. Let me color this in. And let's talk about it. Now, this is looking at a side view of the sock. This is half of the stitches. Let's take a look at what the heel flap is. Here's the heel flap. Here's my description up here. you've been going in a circle for the beginning of this sock. The heel flap is often knit back and forth. So you're not going in a circle anymore. You're going back and forth across half of the stitches only. You're actually going to ignore the other half. So if we look back at this sock, we're only doing, if we think about this as a circle, half of the circle we just leave alone, and we only knit the back half in terms of trying to process what's going on. You're only knitting across half of them. You're actually going to end up with a little rectangle. Now, from the side view, it may not look like that, but that's what we have. We have a little rectangle. It's going to be a little rectangle that dangles off the back of what you created so far. Often, to have some integrity to this heel flap, they will tell you to slip every other stitch on the right side and just purl across the wrong side. And what that does is it creates rows of bigger and smaller stitches. It especially creates slip stitches along the edges. That's going to be important later. So if a pattern is telling you on this heel flap to at least slip the first stitch of every row, there's a reason for that. So if we were to look at what we created so far, we would have a tube with a little rectangle hanging off of it. We have a lot of geometric shapes that are going to be happening in this. So we have a tube with a rectangle hanging off of it. What happens next is going to happen, like our needle is at the bottom here, whatever type of needle you're using. And it's really far away from the needle or needles that's holding the other half of the stitches right now. So the thing may look really funky right now. The next step is something called the heel turn. And that's this little bit right down here. There's a lot of pieces to the heel. The heel in some ways is the most intricate part of your sock. So what it's doing is it's taking the bottom of that rectangle and it's curving it. This right here, what I drew here for us to take a peek at, is actually the bottom of the heel flap. So the heel turn, we're still working with only the flap. You're going to start by knitting just past the center and ignoring the other stitches. You're going to turn around in the middle of the row, which is often called a short row, but this one isn't often described as a like wrap and turn short row, that kind of thing. But you're going to go just past the center and work short rows that are going to involve knit two together and slip knits, and often slip stitches too. I couldn't fit everything in here, but there's a way to go back and forth. So you're going to go there and then back out, and then back out, and then back out. You're going to zigzag back and forth. That's how the rows are going to feel. You're going into the center and then doing a really short row of only a few stitches, and then you're knitting more on each row as you go. And what that does is it curves the heel. So it's going to wrap around. The heel flap is actually going to wrap around your heel. Think about where the Achilles tendon is and all that kind of stuff. It's going to make the flap wrap around, and this bottom part is going right under your heel. That's called the heel turn. So if you see instructions in a pattern that are telling you not to knit across the whole row, and then you have these really short rows that are getting longer every time, that is what should be happening. Now, the next part is one of the trickiest parts for many people in a sock. It's what's called the gusset. And a gusset refers to anything that gets bigger or smaller that makes space for something else. If you do a thumb gusset on a mitten, you're usually increasing to make space for the thumb. Here, we're actually going to be decreasing. It makes room for the heel and then tries to get us back to the size for the rest of the foot. What it often looks like on the side of a sock is a triangle. You'll see a weird, funky triangular space. But this whole area in here is actually part of the gusset. So let's make all of this blue. I'm leaving that line there to make us think of a triangle, but there's also going to be, this is part of what is happening in this section. All of this gets knit while you are doing the gusset, because we're finally going to come back to those stitches that were left way up here. So part D, the heel gusset. So here's a picture right now of what you've knit so far at this point. And it probably looks pretty crazy because we've got our cuff, which is still hanging out on needles up here. I'm going to use red for what is on needles when we start this section. That's the stitches we've been forgetting about for this whole entire time. We've got the flap that is curved around in here. And we've got the heel turn at the very bottom. So we've got stitches that are on a needle up here, or needles, and we've got stitches that are on a needle down here. And then we have these big gaps. Where these black lines are big gaps between those two needles. So we need to bridge the gap to continue on. The steps of this, I've written out a lot of steps here. How the gusset starts is you're going to be knitting across the heel, which is already on a needle. You're going to pick up stitches across this barrier, up one side of the heel flap. And you often pick them up through those slipped stitches that we talked about up top. So there's ways to make it easier. Then you're going to knit across your instep, the top of your foot. For the first time you've touched those stitches in a really long time. Then it will tell you to pick up stitches across the other side of your heel flap. And often they'll tell you to go halfway across your heel turn. They'll tell you to set up a new spot for your beginning of round. There's all these different ways to do that. But essentially, you've circled everything that's left so you can start knitting in a circle again. And this rectangle is created by decreasing. Now you're going to decrease, and the spots you're going to decrease are up at the top, like right before and right after those instep stitches. So often what will happen at this point, if you're on 3 needles, there might be 1 needle for the instep and then 2 needles, because there's a lot of stitches here. There's a lot more stitches than you started with if you pick up stitches on either side of the heel flap. And if you kept going straight, it wouldn't fit your foot. We need to account for the slope, the shape of someone's foot. It's really ingenious how someone mapped this out and figured it out, because there's a lot more going on around your ankle. And all of these different pieces help take care of that. Once you've picked up all the way around, it is usually a pattern will have instructions that tell you to decrease, and it's often every other round. A lot of ways that decreases work in patterns is you decrease on one row, and then you have another row that sets it in place. And then you decrease again, and another row that sets it in place. So that makes this triangle, because we are taking stitches out and bringing the number of stitches down to usually the original number of stitches. And there's all kinds of ways to make this look pretty. I'm not going over the specifics of that. They're mentioned in some of the writing here, but I'm not going over the specifics of that because it's a lot to put in one video. But again, I'm just helping you process what a pattern is telling you to do when it tells you to do it. The next piece, once you're down to the same number of stitches that you had in the cuff, the next piece, which is a pretty straightforward one, just like the cuff was, is the foot, the main part of your foot. Honestly, after all that work in all the different heel pieces, it's kind of nice to have some nice meditative, just knit your way until you're ready for the toe. So the foot part, usually you're knitting until you're about 1 inch to 2 inches. I put 1 inch here. Let's change that. Let's say it's 1 inch to 2 inches shy of your total foot length. A lot of this depends on how big the foot is, how many decreases you're doing. It's hard to say that there's one sock pattern that's going to work for everybody. If you leave yourself 1 inch to 2 inches at the end for the toe, sometimes you might have to play around with that and change it. The toe is often made with even decreases. It's not going to try to shape around the big toe and go down. It just evenly decreases to make space for your toes to fit in there without it being super bulky. And if you take a look at this up here, this is a top view of half of the stitches. So if we talk about a top and a bottom, the edges of half those stitches, you're going to decrease on either side of half of those stitches and flip it over and decrease on either side of another half of those stitches. So what we're looking at right here is half of the stitches. And if you follow the nice decreases they tell you to make, it will look like they are going in towards the center. And again, just like with the gusset, it's every other row. So it's decreasing on both sides of the top half, flipping over, decreasing on both sides of the bottom half, and then knitting around to set those decreases in place, and then doing that again. And oftentimes, you're doing that until you're sometimes down to about a quarter of the stitches you had before. Some patterns will take you right down to 8 stitches. Some patterns will tell you to do this before that. You may decide after making a pair of socks that you don't want them as pointy as the pattern tells you to, and you may want to shift that, which means you may want to stop before all the decreases are done, but you may need to compensate for that by making your foot length a little longer before you do the decreases. That's all going to come with time. And that's probably going to come with a few socks that don't quite work out right. And that's okay, because that's how you figure out what does work. When you're down to the prescribed numbers of stitches, you bind off. And often you're binding off, taking what's left on the top and what's left on the bottom and working them together. The most traditional way to do that without leaving a seam is called the Kitchener stitch. And it's a sewn bind off, but there's a lot of other ones too. Again, I've got a video on the Kitchener stitch. It's not something I'm going to go over in detail here because this video is going to be long enough as it is. Let's take a look at my sock that I brought home from work to show you all of these different parts of the sock on a physical sock. Okay, so here is my Hermione's Everyday Sock from the shop. Still has the tag on it. And let's take a look at all the different pieces. Again, the stripes may actually help us see a few of these pieces. So this is a regularly striping sock yarn. And the cuff of the Hermione's Everyday Sock starts with 1x1 ribbing, knit 1, purl 1, and then it has a texture stitch all the way down. So this is our cuff from top to bottom with a few inches of that elastic ribbing at the top, and then it has more of a straight, there's a textured stitch in there. It's hard to see. But again, we're knitting in the round. So there's where the foot goes in, right? To match it up with the side view, right here, what looks like the mosaic tile kind of jig jog there, that's a really specific heel flap that the Hermione's Everyday Sock has. And again, it's half the stitches. We have half over here and we have half over here that were used in this. If we turn this just a quarter, so we can see that's the whole flap right here. And once the sock is totally shaped up, it's a little hard to see the different pieces separately. But we have a rectangle here that has the up and down is actually a really funky style of heel flap. I can't remember the name of it right now, but it's made with slip stitches and it's got a garter edging to it. So this is 1/2 of the sock that goes much further down. And see that little ziggy zag? If I turn the sock over, it's not there in the same fashion on this side. The pattern just keeps going because when all that work was being done, these stitches just hung out on a separate needle. Now, if I tilt this just a little bit like this, again, we see the curve at the bottom of this. That's my heel turn. And the heel turn came in and did really short rows, go in halfway, and then work your way out by doing shorter rows. They get longer and longer as you go. That's why the stripe sequence is totally off here, because the only thing I was knitting was right across here. And so it is thick and chunky in terms of the color because it happened very quickly over only a few stitches. So the stripe suddenly got really thick because it's not going around even half of the stitches of the sock. It's only going across a few, and it's picking up stitches as it goes. So what you end up with here is close to the number of stitches along the bottom. Sometimes it's a little shy of that. But then the gusset, if we turn this back to the side view, here's the flap, here's the heel turn. The gusset was, take a look at these stripes. Instead of going this way, suddenly the stripes turn and they're going the same direction as the heel. So there are stitches on a needle here. We pick up stitches across the edge of the heel flap. We start knitting across those stitches that have been hanging out. You pick up stitches along this end and you end up back here again. But you end up with, there's the half the stitches we started with, a lot more stitches that we've picked up on both sides of the heel flap and the stitches on the heel turn under here. So you've got tons more stitches. If we kept knitting with this circumference, the foot would be really, really wide. Now, if that works, if you have wider feet than you have ankles and calves, you can modify this, but a traditional pattern will assume an average size foot where we want to get back down to the same number of stitches we had up here. So the decreases create this triangle looking thing. These are decreases here, and they match on this side to get us down to, you can see this is really wide and it gets narrower. And then the neat part about the Hermione's everyday sock is there's still patterning on the top half, but none on the bottom, because sometimes patterning on the bottom of your feet feels kind of funny. So you go straight until you hit the decreases. Now the decreases viewed for the toe, viewed from the side, will look a little funky like this. But if we fold it the way the picture was, it's knitting straight across and decreasing on both sides, and then flipping around, decrease, knit across, decrease, is going to lead to this nice rounded shape. And it's only every other row. It also leads to a little snub nose thing if you fold it the other direction. But eventually, what you're going to do is see at this point here, if I open up the top there, that row of blue, that's my Kitchener stitch right there. Instead of binding off and sewing together and having a big seam there, the Kitchener stitch leaves it without looking like it's got a seam. And that is all the pieces of a sock. One style that you can knit to make a sock. So I hope you enjoyed the video of just some of the basics of one style, a more traditional style of making a sock. We can always look at other styles. For toe up, there are many different ways to start it. And I am not as well versed in all the different ways to start a toe up sock, but I can talk about some of the basics of the way I like to make them, which is going to be a little different than other people's traditional way of starting at the very toe. I've got a way that starts a little bit further. It does a short row toe in terms of going in and back out, rather than some of them start with the very toe and expand. So, but I wanted to tackle a little bit of traditional sock knitting. We may try something like the Hermione's everyday sock as a knit along in the spring or summer. We're still chewing that over. We still have our Echo Point shawl knit along going on right now at the time of this filming. Let me know any other questions you have in the comments. A lot of people are asking really fun questions, and some of them I can answer, and some of them are a little beyond me. I know a lot of stuff. I do not know everything. And I'm not able to make a video on everything, but I can always try. It does not hurt to ask. Because, the worst I'm going to say, hopefully, is, I'm sorry, that's not something I feel comfortable making a video on because I don't want to lead you astray. Let me know your thoughts, though, definitely. I used to advertise a lot about doing Zoom appointments and things. That's becoming more challenging now that the shop is open regular hours again. So reach out to me. I will help as much as I can. We are doing in-shop appointments. I'm booked about 2 to 3 weeks out with those, but you can always contact the shop. The shop phone number, we're there Tuesdays through Saturdays, 10 to 5, is 828-877-3550. Phone help is often challenging because we don't know how busy we'll be in the shop, but you can call to see what my schedule looks like. You can email me at rebecca@sundragonartandfiber.com. You can leave questions here. I respond to things as I can. And consider subscribing. Where our subscription numbers are doing really well, which is fantastic. Check out some of our other videos. We have a Patreon account for the entire Sundragon community. It is patreon.com/sundragon if you would like to sign up for a monthly subscription of support. We have behind the scenes videos, things like that. We don't necessarily have members only instructional videos. I like to keep those over here on YouTube. But if you'd like to support the time and effort that goes into these videos, please consider a monthly subscription. You'll get your name at the end of this video. And as I always like to say, may your crafting be filled with joy and confidence. Thanks so much for watching. Bye. Were you interrupting my filming before, huh? Oh, now you've got nothing to say? Yes. I've already given you too many treats today, kitty. Yeah.